how's it going, guys? This is Ryo Murata, photographer based in Tokyo. So today I won't be shooting, unfortunately not be shooting with a camera today, but more like talking about a camera that I've been using, which is the GW690 3rd gen from Fujifilm. So it's been, what, 2 years ever since I purchased my GW690 Gen 3, and it has been my sort of like main camera for shooting medium format, and my backup being the Mamiya 645. And I thought it would be a great time to talk about this camera, specifically talking about the characteristics, and after using it for 2 years, give you guys my insight of this camera, because there are a fair amount of people who are interested in picking up this camera, or maybe they are at a point where they're thinking of purchasing this camera or maybe something else, and hopefully I could give you guys some kind of insight on whether or not this is like worth a camera to purchase, because it is getting expensive, you know. So yeah, let's get going. So FYI, keep in mind that I purchased my GW690 2 years ago, so back in 2020 or so, for roughly 50,000 yen, and this is sort of like a barometer or some kind of like a area to keep in mind, that 50,000 yen, if you convert that to American dollars, USD right now, and due to the sort of like the currency fluctuating around while the US dollar is becoming real expensive, it's roughly $370 back in like 2 years ago when I purchased it. Holy crap. So keep that in mind. And right now, if you live in the United States, everything you purchase in Japan is like 20-30% cheaper right now. $1 right now costs 135 yen right now, which is insane. So people who are traveling to Japan right now, you have a lot of opportunities to purchase at a cheaper price. So we went off topic a little bit. But however, in 2022, the price of the GW690 actually increased significantly. Right now, in Japan, it costs like 100,000 yen. So that's roughly, converting back to US dollars, that's roughly $750 to maybe $800, somewhere around that range. So that's like what, 20-30% increase in overall price over the course of 2-3 years. So keep that in mind. So keep in mind that because Japanese yen right now is like really cheap, it's actually far more advantageous for foreigners to come to Japan right now to do any kind of shopping if you want, because it's like 20-30% cheaper right now, and $1 right now is like 135 yen. So if you spend $1, you can purchase 135 yen of goods. And because Japan hasn't experienced that much of an inflation, I mean, for a lot of American people, it's actually a bargain right now to shop in Japan right now. So where to begin? So let's start with the 8 shots actually. So this is something that I actually talked in my Hasselblad video, if I'm right, a long time ago, that this camera can only shoot 8 shots, love or hate. And above all the medium format cameras, 645, 6x6, 6x7, 6x8, take that out because it's hard to find a 6x8 camera right now, or a 6x9. I have to admit, the 6x9 format has the worst gas per mileage in the photography arena, film photography arena, period. It's like driving sort of like a Dodge Ram across the United States right now. And if you guys live in the United States, you guys know what I'm talking about, because gas is so expensive. Similar to Japan right now, it's like freaking expensive, and it would be like an idiot to like drive a Dodge Ram that has like what, 1 gas per mileage is what, how many kilometers? And I remember like 20 years ago, if I'm right, roughly 20 years ago, when I lived in the United States, my dad actually rented a Dodge Ram from Seattle to Vancouver, and we took a road trip from Seattle to Vancouver. And back then, 20 years ago, I think it was like $1.50 per gas, per gallon of gas, and right now it's like $5 if I'm right in the United States. So it's not like the best to like drive that car right now in the United States and in Japan actually. So it's basically that going on, especially shooting with this camera. Going onto topic again, because film prices, same as gas, it's increasing. The price is like increasing significantly, and when you look at the long-term expense of how much money you're spending to shoot with this camera, gets really ridiculous if you like shoot a lot of shots. So I roughly shoot like 2-3 rolls or maybe 4 rolls per month. So if I backtrack and calculate, it would cost like roughly $50 or so per month to shoot with this camera. And like if you look at the other end of the spectrum, like 645 on the other hand, like you can get more shots per roll. And if I'm right, if I shoot with just 645 format only for my channel, I mean, I could probably get away with maybe 2 rolls of film per month, and that would like slash the overall expense of my total, consumption of film by half, because I get double the, shots per roll. So that's like one thing to keep in mind. And that could like add significantly if you're doing it for like 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years down the road. I mean, one box of film, let's say Kodak's 200, costs like $50 in the United States, so take that as a standard. If you shoot with a GW690, $50 per month, multiply by 12 for 1 year, that's like $600 and as an expense. But if you shoot with 645, however, and if you shoot like half the rolls, but you get the same amount of shots, get 15 shots per roll, you can slash out like overall cost from $600 to $300, and you can basically save $300 every month. When you go for the second year, you save $600. When you go for the third year, you save $900. And $900, when you think about like when you continue, probably the majority of us will keep on shooting with film. 3 years it feels really long, but it happens really quickly. And $900, you can buy another decent like film camera, a medium format camera, for roughly $900. You could get another 645 type of format, maybe a Pentax Mamiya 645 with a lens included, or maybe another GW690 if you want. I mean, there's like so many options available, and within that, amount of money that you saved up front in the first like 3 years or so, you can basically invest that in a YouTube channel, or you can invest it into like so many things instead of getting the GW690. So I mean, there's like a lot of possibilities that open up by just saving that much money. And in my case, I actually tend to like shoot with this camera because I just love the format, the 6x9 format. And at the same time, you guys know that I don't shoot that frequently, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And it's like, I mean, it's like a trade-off, in order to get something, you have to like sacrifice something. So if I shoot with a GW690, I'm losing the opportunities to travel outside Tokyo, but I get a larger negative and stuff like that, more resolution, etc., etc. going on. And you have to look at the great things about shooting with 6x9, which is less amount of shots taken per roll makes you, I have to admit, it makes you want to think more about photography, due to the fact that because you only have 8 shots at your disposal, or maybe 16 shots if you have 2 rolls, you have to like consider the amount of time that you have, and on top of that, you have to like carefully predict whether or not that exposure that you're shooting, like is the f-stop correct, or is the shutter speed correct, or is the exposure right when you look at the the lighting meter, and the composition. Like you can't like shoot vertical and after that can't shoot like horizontal on the same like type of like area, due to the fact that if you do that, you only get 4 shots, 1 vertical, 1 horizontal, 1 vertical, 1 horizontal for every shot. You only get 4 shots. So you have to like decide, should I go with vertical orientation or like horizontal orientation? There's like so many factors to think, and I guess this is sort of like the basics of photography. Like, I mean, you will make a lot of mistakes along the way, but because you don't have 8 shots compared to like 645, you know that, oh, I can mess up this shot and get this one if I do it correctly, kind of. It's like so much a 35 mil because you have 36 exposures. You can like trial and error rigorously, and even if you mess up, you still have like more shots at your disposal. However, the GW690, you can't do that, so you become like really slow, and you have to be like really patient when shooting with this camera. And I guess that's one of the things that this camera actually taught me over the course of the 2 years. And I know it is a really tedious task, but once you start shooting with this camera, your pace of shooting goes way down. And the more you shoot with a 6x9, this is something I realized over the course of the 2 years, but when you go back to 35mm film format, specifically, I shoot with a Nikon F3 sometimes, but it kind of lowers the amount of shots you take with the 35 because that sort of like 6x9 format has been engraved to your like body and soul, and because you can only shoot like 8 shots on that camera and you're becoming used to that, you know, system, that ecosystem, when you go back to 35 you realize how efficient the 35mm is, and at the same time how flexible, how fast, how, you know, if I mean efficient, I said it again, but it's like fast paced and you can like shoot like really at an easier like time in a time frame, or it's hard to explain actually. So okay, so another area I need to like point about this camera is that I think I mentioned it in the Hasselblad video that a long time ago I mentioned it, that the 6x9, especially the GW series, GW690, the first generation, second generation, and the third generation all have a fixed like 90mm lens, and if we convert that to 35mm film format, this lens becomes a 38mm focal length, and people are gonna love this lens or hate this lens. I typically am neutral about this lens. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people say it's a great lens, it's a really sharp lens. However, I typically love the 50mm focal length due to the fact that I frequently shoot like architectural buildings type of like stuff, and when you go below 50mm, as in the focal length, and when you go wider than 50mm, what happens is that there's going to be some kind of distortion going on, so the lines don't look straight at all. And I guess this might take some people off, but if you're doing landscapes and stuff like that, it won't take that much people off. But I typically notice this significantly when I'm editing my photos, and because there's some distortion going on in post, I have to like shorten the lines, especially when it's like buildings and stuff like that, like architecture or some kind of like landscape that has some lines in there. I basically have to like tinker around in Photoshop, unfortunately, and crop the photo a little bit because I need a little bit of space. However, because it's a 38mm, what's great about this lens in particular is you can actually crop into the photo if you want. And this is like great thing about photography is that if you shoot, I mean, if you shoot wide open, not wide open, but if you shoot at a wide angle, you can basically crop in the image. And because this camera is a 6x9 format, it has enough resolution to retain that image quality and you won't have any problems. And this can be like set across any kind of medium format, whether or not it's 645 or 6x6 or 6x7 or 6x9, like, because the total image resolution of that medium format is far greater than a full frame camera, you actually get a lot of like resolution left over. Even if you like crop it like 2/3 of that image, maybe 1/3, you still have a lot of like surface area, not surface area, but more like a lot of area to retain that quality in image. So I guess, is there other things to mention about this camera? But like if you're like a nighttime photographer, you won't like this camera at all. I talked it in my sort of like long exposure video when I shot with Cinestill 800T. The GW690 is one of the cameras that piss people off when doing long exposure, because there is that, you know, Fuji ritual where typically a typical camera, you basically press the, well, you will have to like put the, what is it, the aperture dial to bulb mode, and you basically press the shutter release cable and release it, and basically shuts down the shutter completely. That's basically the standard, but the GW690 doesn't let you do that. There's that, you know, function where you basically have to change the aperture dial when it's when the sort of like the aperture's, not the aperture, but when the shutter's like open, in order to close it, you basically have to like change the apertures and stuff like that. And it gets really pissy, you know, it pisses me off actually. So it's not the best cameras to do long exposures, and if you're into those types of cameras, I would highly recommend other types of cameras. This is more like a camera that does well in bright sunlight conditions, and at the same time it probably does worse in low light conditions because it is a larger format. Larger format means that it's prone to camera shake. If it's prone to camera shakes, you need to shoot with a higher shutter speed. So in order to retain the higher shutter speed, you have to like shoot in bright sunny conditions above 1/125th of a second. Below that, you will have a risk of like having camera shake into your image, and there's a lot of factors to keep in mind when shooting with this camera. Okay, so this is going to be like really hard to explain because I'm not a technical geek, camera geek at all. So basically, what's interesting thing about the GW690 that I have to mention is that the shutter itself is not a focal plane shutter. It is a leaf shutter, and if you're into like photography, you know what I'm talking about, but 99% of the people who watch my video don't know what I'm talking about. So focal plane shutters, basically when the shutter, this is included in most cameras typically, like Nikon F3, all 35mm focal length are mostly focal plane shutters, and well, not mirrorless cameras. DSLRs are 100% like focal plane shutter. Basically, there's a shutter curtain at the bottom of the camera, or maybe at the top, basically. And when you press the shutter, the first curtain opens, and it allows light to hit the CMOS sensor or the what we call the film negatives on the back side. And then within that, shutter duration, the second shutter basically follows suit and basically closes the shutter and basically prevents any light from going into the sensor or the color negative. There are pros and cons to that. I don't want to go into details. However, the cons of the focal plane shutter is basically when you're shooting with flash specifically, because if you look at the shutter, like Nikon's F3 specifically, that camera basically can only like sync with a flash at 1/160th of a second, and that's not fast basically. But typically when you're shooting with a flash, you want to freeze that moment, and in order to freeze that moment, you have to like shoot faster than that. You have to shoot like 1/125th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second. And typically speaking, this is like DSLR days actually. But if you shoot above 1/125th of a second when you're using a flash, I mean 1/125th you won't have a problem. But if you shoot like 1/200th of a second, what happens is that this shutter duration, that basically time lag that goes on, basically can't accommodate the the light that basically hits the the backside. So what happens is you get some kind of image like this where basically the shutter curtain is going too slow that it can't like capture the this picture that you're trying to get, and those kinds of problems happen, and you can't like fix that problem. It's unfortunately, especially when you look at the Nikon F3, you can't go faster than 1/60th of a second. If you go beyond that, you get that type of image. However, the great thing about leaf shutters is that time lag never happens on, well, it does happen on a leaf shutter, but the time it syncs with the flash is much faster, meaning that you can basically, if it's a leaf shutter, this like only is advantageous if you use a flash actually. So these types of like shutters, leaf shutters, actually can sync up to 1/500th of a second or maybe faster depending on what kind of manufacturer you're using. But the GW690 goes up to 1/500th of a second, and kind of wonders me, like, this is a landscape type of camera, and why does it have to sync at like 1/500th of a second? And I don't know why the Fujifilm, like what you call the R&D people, thought of like putting a leaf shutter on this camera, but it kind of surprised me. But if you're like shooting in this camera in the studio, you won't have any like problems. I'm gonna be testing with leaf shutters actually in my room actually, and when I have time. So that's like one thing to like mention on my channel. And I guess this is gonna sort of like, some people won't understand what I'm talking about, but if you go into flash photography, it's better to have a camera that has a leaf shutter. And not many cameras have a leaf shutter. The Mamiya 645, I have to mention, is a focal plane shutter, so you can't sync above 1/60th of a second if I'm right. And there are limitations actually. And I don't want to go into super details, but focal plane shutters actually within the camera. Leaf shutters actually accommodated within the lens itself. So keep that in mind. The focal plane shutters is that typically, actually, when you open the back plate of the, when you're basically changing films actually, because there's a focal plane shutter already closed in, like not letting light hit the, the film negatives. The great thing about that is that it prevents dust from entering the lens, and this will hit a lot of people if you're like shooting in really dusty conditions, especially the GW690. And another camera is what was it? Fudge. And this is sort of like a comparison between the GW690 and the Pentax 611. Yeah, the Pentax 611 is actually, the Pentax 6.7 is a focal plane shutter. So basically when you're like changing films, that focal plane shutter is basically locked in, preventing any dust from entering the camera. So, oh shit, my drink just dropped, but so where was I? So basically the focal plane shutter is basically like concealing the elements from having dust going inside. However, the GW690, because there is no focal plane shutter preventing any dust, my light just died. So where was I? So I forgot what I was talking about. So basically the focal plane shutter basically prevents the camera's elements from having dust go inside, while the GW690 specifically does not have focal plane shutter. It has a leaf shutter, which is like located within the camera's lens itself, meaning that dust can easily go into the camera elements. And I mean, it's not the optimum camera to like change films specifically when like shooting outdoors, and I guess that's a pro and that's a con actually, so keep that in mind. So unfortunately I cannot cover everything in this video, but hopefully made some kind of insights what this camera can do, cannot do. Like I said, this camera is like a Dodge Ram, honestly. The worst car with the worst gas per mileage, and in the medium format reel. And because it burns so much film in a short period of time, you have to be careful with that. And however, because film prices, one shutter, one photo costs money, it makes you consciously think about whether or not that shot should be taken or not, and if it's like worth burning your money on actually. So obviously there are a lot of cameras right now, because like I said, this camera's price is increasing significantly over the past 2 years or so, roughly $1,000, no, $800 or so. And I'm kind of surprised that the price almost doubled in the course of 2 years or so. And however, the Mamiya 645, the prices hasn't changed much, which is like hilarious. So I'm like kind of curious, like who's buying this camera specifically, or it might be people who wanted to get a Mamiya 7, but because it was like so expensive and they want a rangefinder type of camera, they kind of came to the GW690 realm. I'm predicting that's happening right now, because the Mamiya 7 is like insane right now in terms of price, while this camera is not that expensive. But people started to realize my channel, I'm becoming famous, I don't know, but I don't know, but hopefully like someone picked up on my videos, me shooting with this camera, and I guess I'm getting more followers and more people are taking attention to this camera. I mean, that's great for Fujifilm for promoting. I'm not getting anything, I'm not getting paid or anything, but yeah. So honestly, there are great cameras besides this camera within that $1,000 price like tag. I mean, if you keep searching, there are a lot of like alternatives to this camera, and hopefully by understanding this camera, hopefully understanding the camera that you shoot with, you will become a better photographer in the long term. So yeah, obviously I haven't covered everything, like the most important parts. Hopefully I said it in this video, and I actually still enjoy shooting with this camera. I will continue shooting with this camera until it breaks down. And right now, as of 2022, this camera's mileage is roughly 294, not shots, this is like rolls. So that's, I'm actually going to be reaching 300 soon, which is pat on the back, because that's a lot. I completely forgot like how many the previous owner like shot with this camera. I remember it was like roughly 200 something. So probably I shot maybe like 50 or 40 rolls if I'm right. So hopefully within the near future I'll make a video on reaching 300 rolls on this camera. And yeah, keep shooting. And this camera's actually still going strong. It hasn't broken down on me yet. So yeah, keep shooting guys and keep failing. You will eventually reach your goal. So we'll see you next time. Peace.